The Go for Growth Show, powered by Beepo.
Hi everyone, welcome to today's episode of the Go for Growth Show. My name is Mark Engelmann and I'm your host today. And on today's show we've got Mr. Garry Taylor, who's calling in from his home in Dubai. Thanks for joining us, Garry.
Welcome up.
Garry, look, rather than introduce you, I'd like you to just tell me about your current role and what you're responsible for.
Okay, thanks, Mark. I guess my current role is Chief Technology Officer for a company called Dataflow. I've been with Dataflow for coming up for 2 years now, and I've just recently made the move to Dubai just a couple of months ago. So still settling into Dubai life, having spent the last pretty much 18 years in Asia, with 10 of those years being based in the Philippines.
Yeah, great. And so I guess as part of that, I mean, I know that throughout your career you have worked in many different countries. I think one of the most interesting stories you've got that you've ever told me is your placement in Manila to grow Macquarie Shared Services office. You grew that to about 1,800 staff over a reasonably short period of time, which is massive. Can you tell me a little bit about that experience and you know what some of your biggest challenges were?
Yeah, sure. I guess initially when I went down to the Philippines, I was based in Hong Kong at the time, and I went down to Manila with the remit of setting up an office of, I think it was 9 desks, if I remember rightly, or 9 heads, as a bit of a pilot to see exactly sort of how it went. And the idea was to start off in the technology field. I'm primarily from a technology background, obviously. And the idea was to go and pilot the idea of doing software testing out of the Philippines office. I guess the proof of the whole thing was that it worked, and we eventually grew the office to 1,800 people over a period of time, which spread way beyond the original sort of software testing and technology arena into a complete shared services center for the entirety of the bank. It was an entertaining experience. I guess initially kicking off and sort of setting up the business, building the business was a bit of a challenge. Getting to know how to sort of transact business in the Philippines was a bit of a challenge. I had a connectivity, I guess, with the Philippines through my wife previous to that. So I knew about the Philippines, but transacting business in the Philippines was a whole new ballgame to me. And I guess in terms of challenges, not only was there the challenge of setting up the business in the Philippines and operating a Philippines business, but one of the biggest challenges I guess I continued to face was this sort of, I guess, lack of belief in what could be offshored and how things could be offshored versus the traditional model of doing everything in the mothership hubs. In that scenario, I guess I was in Hong Kong, which was the hub for the region. Obviously, with Macquarie being an Australian bank, there was a huge hub back in Sydney and in Australia in general. And trying to convince people that there was an opportunity to do some of the work offshore was probably one of the biggest challenges I faced and continue to face right up to the very end of my tenure with Macquarie, quite frankly.
Why do you think that there was that kind of resistance?
I'm not so sure it was a resistance per se. I mean, obviously there's the resistance there's the concern of jobs, which is an ongoing concern, and I guess that's going to be an ongoing concern as time moves forward. I think a lot of it was just the lack of understanding, and the lack of understanding of what could be done and how it could be done, and whether you could disconnect yourself from the sort of physical day-to-day interaction of your mates you worked with, and whether you could, in effect, trust these people that were 1,000 miles away or thousands of miles away to do the same job that you were doing and to sort of give the same responses that you were doing previously in a role. Okay, I think that's probably the biggest concern most people had.
Yeah, great. And so 1,800 people, that's a decent sized organization, right? And I've worked in large organizations before, and from my perspective, I had a previous role as a business improvement specialist, and so that role is all about trying to find efficiencies in processes. basically. And my observation of working in a large organization in the past is that that productivity piece is really hard to manage with the more people that you have. How do you manage productivity in an office of that size?
I think it goes hand in hand with the sort of benefits that some of these offshoring locations can bring, and that is, the adherence to process. So, one of the tips and tricks, I guess, is to make sure that when you're moving this work offshore, you're actually procedurizing everything. You're making sure that everything's documented. Now, that can sound as if it's a bit of a pain to do, but once you've got it procedurized, once you've got a particular set of tasks procedurized, it then becomes repeatable. It then becomes something that you can track and measure. You can put KPIs around it. You can ensure that the task gets repeated time and time again, and then increase the levels of accuracy and repeatability around a particular process.
Yeah, great. And I guess sort of tagging onto that, do you think that is a reason why Macquarie chose the Philippines as a location to build that office?
I think the Philippines was chosen for a number of different reasons. The Philippines does lend itself very, very well to process-based offshoring. And I've obviously worked there for a number of years, and that's certainly one of the fortes of the environment. Once a process is in place, that process continues to be done on a repeatable basis, day in and day out. Sorry, what was the question again, Mark? I've lost track of the question there.
So why do you think Macquarie chose the Philippines?
Oh, sorry, the other obviously excellent reason for choosing the Philippines was the language capability. The English capability in the Philippines is probably the best in the Asia Pac region, and that certainly lends itself very well to process offshore, and especially where you've got to interact with people in different countries at different times of the day. Especially as well if you're dealing with people across the other side of the world, in the western side of the world. The level of English, the capability of English is superb compared to the rest of the Asia region. Yeah,
great. So in Australia, offshoring or outsourcing to an offshore location, something that is kind of on the front of everyone's minds, and a lot of businesses are starting to move offshore. But I guess as a very general statement, I don't think Australians are that used or experienced to working with people from different cultures. What are some of the mistakes you've seen Australians or Westerners in general make when working with people from Asian cultures?
I think probably the biggest mistake is trying to sort of brainwash people from a different culture to be those different people. So, for example, and it doesn't matter whether you're from Australia, the US, the UK, whatever it may be, there is this tendency to go into countries like the Philippines and like these other offshore locations and say, well, this is how I do things back home. This is my kind of culture and my kind of personality back home. Therefore, in order to get the same job done, I need to convert these people into being exactly the same kind of people and same kind of culture as I'm from. And that doesn't always work. People have got their own cultures, their own backgrounds. Leave the cultural aspect as it is in that country. Deal with the culture in that country in the best way you can, and we can talk a little bit more about that later. But focus on sort of moving the task as opposed to trying to move personalities, I guess, is one of the sort of key things I would put forward there.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And what would some of your key tips be for any businesses that are looking at embarking on an offshore initiative? What are some of the things? I mean, you touched on, proceduralizing your systems and processes, but is there anything else beyond that businesses should be thinking about when they start their offshore project?
Yeah, I think the key trick really is to start simple. And Mark, I think we've discussed this previously. It's my sort of big passion, I guess, in terms of how you start the offshoring journey. if you start simple, I think you both learn from the concept. You both, both sides, both parties learn from the experience.
Yeah.
Because the offshoring party has got to learn how to offshore and how to procedurize. The party that's in the offshore location has got to learn how to take those tasks on, start to learn about how you and your company works, and in some cases learn about the cultural aspects, learn about the linguistic differences, the way people use different words in different situations, the colloquialisms that crop into conversation. That's all got to be learned and transitioned. But once you get the first couple of processes over those hurdles and into production, you can then start to look further up the value chain in terms of what kind of work you offshore, or the complexity of the tasks that you offshore. But my key trick, I think, is to start simple. And I guess the other sort of key thing, which I've already touched upon, is to work with the cultural differences that you're coming across. Just because one culture does things in a slightly different way is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a different way of doing things. The culture and the vibe in the Philippine offices will be very, very different to the typical vibe that you would have in an Australian office, for example.
Yeah.
So rather than trying to sort of eradicate that vibe or completely change that vibe, perhaps learn to work with it and how best to work with it in that scenario.
Yeah, definitely. And from my experience, I know that, yes, Australians and Filipinos are different. Great example is at our, Christmas parties and anniversaries, where the Filipinos are having a great time singing and dancing, playing games. There's not an alcoholic drink to be seen anywhere. And then over in the corner are all the Australians who are too embarrassed to get up and, do the karaoke or have a dance, whatever. And that's, they're there with their beers in hand, having a good time too. And that's okay.
I agree. And there's a tendency to kind of mock that at times. These guys are sitting there without beers, laughing and singing and enjoying themselves. And why mock that when conversely a typical Christmas party, perhaps back in Australia, would end up with lots of people getting drunk, falling on the floor, and making complete sort of asses of themselves, quite frankly. And how would the Filipinos think about the Australians in that context? So it's kind of like looking at things from both lenses, I guess, both directions.
Yeah, great. That's some really great insight there, Garry. I've got one last question for you, and it probably suits you really, really well given your background and expertise. But our listeners are always interested in new pieces of technology or applications or new service providers that can help them grow their business. Have you been using anything in particular lately that our listeners should know about?
I guess I can't give away too many details. That'd be my trade secrets. But I think in general, Mark, there's a few sort of areas that I'm pretty passionate about at the moment. One, I guess, is the use of cloud-based services. I think Beepo are already well down the path in terms of cloud-based usage of office productivity products like the Google Suite.
Yep.
That's just a classic example of a I guess, a complete change in direction to the classic desktop type environment that most people are aware of or used to. And it takes a brave change to move towards a different environment, but and moving towards different productivity suites can bring all sorts of different gains. So cloud-based productivity, cloud-based services in general from the likes of Google and Amazon feature highly on my sort of radar at the moment. I think the days of sort of hosted or corporately owned data centers with lots of lights and servers and cabling buzzing away in the background somewhere are kind of long gone.
Yep.
And I think the quicker people embrace that sort of cloud technology, obviously in a secure fashion, the security's got to be top of mind. But the quicker we embrace cloud technology, the better, I think, at the moment. And the last real thing that's on my radar, I guess, at the moment is the whole concept of RPA or robotic process automation, which is kind of like that sort of next step from offshoring, I guess. I think a lot of people would struggle going from sort of what they know today and dropping straight into RPA, which is the concept of robotizing, I guess, a manual day-to-day task. Those people that have gone through the offshoring process I think we'll find the shift into RPA and sort of efficiencies through RPA a lot simpler. But RPA in general, I think, is a big sort of technology that's waiting to happen in the next couple of years.
Yeah, it's certainly front of mind for a lot of businesses, and I've been reading a lot in the media about process automation and various software applications that are really helping businesses do that. So no, totally agree. All right, Garry. Well, that was my last question. Thanks for your time. It's been a great chat, and look forward to catching up with you soon.
Thanks again, Mark. Cheers.
The Go for Growth Show, powered by Beepo.